Let me ask you something. How many times have you found yourself over-explaining your worth to someone who barely valued your presence? How often have you stayed in conversations long after the silence should have spoken for you? We live in a world that glorifies attention, where being loud is mistaken for being strong, and where silence is seen as weakness. But what if I told you that silence, true, calculated silence, isn't weakness at all? It's power. Raw, unapologetic, stoic power. You've been taught wrong. Society told you that if you love harder, explain better, or stay available, eventually they'll come around. But has that ever actually worked? Be honest. Or did it leave you drained, confused, and invisible? The truth is, they don't value what's always accessible. They value what disappears. What becomes rare. What haunts them in the silence. This video isn't for people who still want to beg for closure. This is for the ones who are done performing. Done explaining. Done shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. Because when you learn to ignore, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, you start rewriting the entire game. You take your power back. You stop being the audience in someone else's performance, and become the mystery that keeps them awake at night. That's what we're going to unlock today. A step-by-step breakdown of how to use emotional discipline, silence, and stoicism to make your absence speak louder than any text, any argument, any final word ever could. And don't get it twisted. This isn't about ghosting for attention. It's about transformation. It's about choosing yourself, quietly, powerfully, and without needing applause. It's about embracing what I call stoic relationships, connections built not on validation, but on value. And if you stay with me till the end, I'll show you how to make your silence not just memorable, but unforgettable. How to evolve so quietly that they don't even see you coming, but they'll never forget that you left. Because here's the secret, real growth doesn't make noise. It happens in silence, behind closed doors, while the world thinks you're down. And when you return, you won't need to announce it. They'll feel it. This is your wake-up call, your strategy session, and your power move all rolled into one. So buckle up, stay focused, and lean in, because what's coming next is going to flip everything you thought you knew about connection, control, and personal power. You're about to discover why ignoring them isn't cruelty, it's clarity. Why your silence isn't rejection, it's evolution. And why the most stoic relationships don't need words to leave an impact. Ready for the shift? Let's begin. 1. Detachment is not coldness, it's clarity. They will misunderstand you. That's the first truth you must swallow. When you stop explaining yourself, when you go quiet, when you begin to detach not because you don't care but because you finally do, about yourself, they will call you cold, bitter, heartless. But what they really mean is they've lost access. Access to your emotional feedback, your reactions, your presence that used to validate them without effort. See, we're conditioned to believe that caring always looks loud, calls, texts, arguments, begging. But there's a form of caring that's quieter, deeper, more potent. It's caring enough to protect your peace, to reclaim your center, to remove yourself from cycles that do nothing but confuse and drain you. Detachment, in this way, is not a lack of love. It is the highest form of love, love redirected inward, where it should have gone all along. When you detach, you stop being manipulated by the highs and lows of someone else's emotional roller coaster. You stop being available for breadcrumbs, for half-effort connections, for anyone who only shows up when it suits them. And that is terrifying to those who were used to controlling you through your own feelings. The ones who once had you reacting at the drop of a cryptic message, the ones who knew how to make you chase with just enough attention to keep you hoping, they panic when their control fades. Because now, they can't read you. They can't move you. You're still, unbothered, unreadable. That stillness? That's your power. That's the moment the narrative flips. You're no longer the emotional respondent. You've become the observer. And the moment you stop playing your old part, the entire game crumbles. This is the core of Stoicism, being in full command of your response, owning your energy so completely that no one can hijack it again. But here's the catch. This level of detachment isn't something you fake. It's something you become. And becoming this version of yourself means going through the discomfort of no longer reacting when everything in you used to scream for connection. It means sitting in the silence you used to fill with explanations. It means choosing stillness when your instincts want to chase. But as you hold that line, something inside you shifts. You stop craving their attention. You start enjoying your own presence. You stop explaining your silence. You start exploring your strength. The same people who once had emotional power over you begin to feel powerless in your absence. Not because you punished them, but because you no longer needed them to understand your worth. And that's what truly haunts them. Not your silence, but the realization that they no longer get to be the center of your emotional life. So ask yourself, who have you been shrinking for? Whose behavior have you been justifying? Who have you given repeated access to despite their consistent failure to show up for you? When you answer that honestly, detachment becomes not only obvious, it becomes necessary. You realize that the version of you who begged for crumbs, who lowered their standards, who tolerated disrespect, that version is gone. And what's left is someone so grounded, so calm, so whole, they no longer chase peace. They are the peace. This shift is subtle. At first, you don't even recognize it happening. You're still tempted to explain, to justify, to ask why. But then one day you don't. One day, the silence feels lighter than the conversation. One day, your inner stillness feels more rewarding than their validation. That's when you know you're evolving. Not into someone colder, but someone clearer. Because real clarity doesn't scream. It doesn't argue. It doesn't beg. It simply exits. Detachment, when done right, is the most honest answer you'll ever give. It says everything you need to say without a single word. And for those living in chaos, that silence becomes unbearable. They'll test you. Of course they will. They'll reach out. Maybe not directly, but with likes, stories, mutual friends. They'll try to re-enter through subtle doors. And when you don't respond, when you hold that detachment not with anger but with calm, they feel it. They feel the boundary. They feel your absence not as a punishment but as a mirror. And most people aren't ready for that mirror. Because in your silence, they see what they did. What they lost. Who you became. That's the clarity they never expected. That's why detachment isn't about games. It's about growth. It's not silence to make them wonder. It's silence to make yourself whole. In Stoic relationships, emotional restraint is not repression, it's refinement. You train yourself to feel fully but react rarely. You remind yourself that not every emotion deserves expression, not every connection deserves maintenance, not every argument deserves your participation. Detachment lets you see the situation as it is, not as you hoped it would be. And in that clarity, you stop negotiating your worth. You stop explaining your boundaries. You stop proving your heart. Because the right ones will never need proof. They'll feel your value in your presence. And when they don't, you detach, not because you're done loving, but because you've started honoring yourself. So let them misunderstand. Let them tell stories. Let them sit in their assumptions. You owe no explanations. You owe no performance. You owe no more of yourself to people who didn't cherish what you freely gave. This is your power now, not to control others, but to control yourself. To master your peace. To guard your energy. To move with calm certainty in a world addicted to chaos. This is stoicism in motion, not just in thought. This is emotional maturity, not emotional numbness. And this is how you become the one they remember. Not because you shouted your worth, but because you walked away in silence and never looked back. 2. Your silence speaks louder than any words. There's a moment when words begin to lose their meaning, when explaining, defending, and justifying start to sound like noise, not clarity. That moment is the turning point. Because when you go silent, not to manipulate, not to punish, but because you're finally done performing, that's when your presence becomes unforgettable. Silence is not the absence of emotion, it is the discipline of emotional control. You've probably been told that silence makes you weak, that staying quiet means you lost. But ask yourself, how many times did talking make it better? How many times did opening up, again and again, change anything except your own peace? See, silence is the language of strength. It's the language of someone who knows their worth so deeply they no longer need to scream it. When you go quiet, you create space. And space is where their self-reflection begins. That's where their mind starts to wander. That's where your absence starts to echo. And here's what they never see coming. The version of you who used to double text, who used to beg for clarity, who used to fill the silence with explanations and apologies, he's gone. And what remains is someone they can't read, can't predict, can't control. That shift? That's what turns your silence into a scream. It's the paradox. They hear you louder now that you've stopped speaking. Because people aren't haunted by what you said. They're haunted by what you didn't. By what they expected to hear but didn't receive. By the void your silence creates in their emotional landscape. They keep checking for a message. They refresh their feed. They scan for your name. And every time you're not there, their brain fills in the blanks. And that is how silence becomes power. You're not cold. You're calculated. You're not passive. You're precise. Because saying nothing when everything in you wants to explain is a form of self-mastery few ever achieve. But let's be honest, it's hard. It feels unnatural. Your mind wants closure. Your heart wants expression. Your ego wants to be heard. And yet, the most powerful choice is to say nothing. To let your stillness become the evidence of your transformation. To let your absence be the only explanation they get. And here's why this works. When you were always available, always vocal, always expressing, they didn't need to value you. You were consistent, predictable, reliable. Now that you're quiet, you become rare. And rarity creates value. This is the currency of Stoic relationships. Not drama, not confusion, not begging. Just calm, clear silence that says, I don't need to be loud to be felt. I don't need to speak to be heard. I don't need to prove anything to anyone who couldn't see me when I gave them all of me. The moment you go silent, they are forced to face the reality they've avoided. Your worth wasn't in your words. It was in your presence. And now that presence is gone. You see, most people listen to react. They don't listen to understand. But when you say nothing, they have no choice but to sit with their own thoughts. To listen to the emptiness they created. That's where the real regret begins. And it's not because you made them feel bad. It's because for the first time, they feel the cost of not treating you right. The cost of not listening when you were still speaking. The cost of not valuing you when your love was freely given. This is what Stoicism teaches us. That strength isn't in control over others, it's in control over ourselves. That mastery isn't about dominating people, it's about disciplining our own emotions. That sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. So if you're wondering whether your silence matters, yes, it does. It speaks volumes. It creates contrast. It builds mystique. It redefines you in their mind not as the one who needed them, but as the one who disappeared with dignity. And no amount of noise can compete with that kind of stillness. No amount of posts, stories, or cryptic captions will ever replace the depth of what they feel when they realize they can no longer reach you. You are no longer emotionally available. No longer playing the game. No longer performing for someone else's validation. You're done speaking to those who never really listened. And in that decision, you become rare. You become the one that slipped through their fingers. The one they can't replace. The one they'll think about in moments of quiet, not because you shouted for attention, but because you became the silence they can't ignore. So let the silence do the work. Let it reshape their perception. Let it amplify your value in the one way that words never could. Remember, absence has a sound. It's called impact. And your silence? It's the impact they never expected, but now can't escape. If this part of the message hits something deep inside you, do me a favor. Like this video, and drop a comment that says, number 1, to let me know you're here. Subscribe if you're on this path with me. Because this silence, It's not the end. It's only the beginning. 3. Reactions confirm relevance. Starve them of both. Reactions are the currency of emotional power. Every time you respond, whether it's with anger, sadness, sarcasm, or even silence masked as bitterness, you're confirming something deeper than words ever could. They still matter to you. And that confirmation is all they need to keep their grip on your mind, your peace, and your sense of worth. But let me ask you, what do they actually deserve? Do they deserve the time it takes to craft a message? Do they deserve the emotional weight that hits your chest when they finally respond after days of absence? Do they deserve the mental space they occupy rent-free while you rehearse every potential outcome, every scenario, every reason why they acted the way they did? The answer is no. They don't deserve it. Because they've already shown you how little they value your presence when it costs them nothing. And every reaction you give them? That's you paying their ego with your energy. That's you proving that they still have emotional leverage. But what happens when you stop reacting? What happens when the usual triggers don't work? When their carefully placed stories, their delayed replies, their breadcrumb messages land on deaf ears? The game dies. The power dynamic collapses. Because suddenly, they're not getting their emotional fix. They're not seeing your name in their notifications. They're not watching you spiral in frustration, in overthinking, in emotional dependence. They're met with silence, stillness, detachment. And that's when the panic sets in. You've become the vending machine that stopped spitting out emotional candy. You've become the button that doesn't trigger any result. You've become unreadable, and to someone addicted to control, that's worse than rage. That's psychological starvation. They start pushing harder, testing boundaries, making noise, trying to elicit any kind of reaction, even if it's negative. Because to them, your anger still means they matter. Your sadness still means they have access. But when you don't react, when you starve them of both attention and response, they begin to doubt their influence. They begin to feel irrelevant. And that, my friend, is the true turning point. Because now, your silence doesn't just feel like distance, it feels like dominance. It feels like you've outgrown them. And in many ways you have. This isn't about playing games. This is about stoicism. About emotional mastery. About understanding that not everything requires a response. That not everyone earns the right to pull your strings. That your peace is not a community resource. It's yours. Guarded. Earned. Reserved. They will accuse you of being petty. Of being immature. Of being unbothered just to make a point. Let them. Because those accusations are nothing more than projections. They need to villainize your detachment to justify their own inability to meet your standard. They'll say you've changed. That you're different now. And you are. You've stopped trading your emotional currency for temporary comfort. You've stopped sacrificing your growth for someone else's ego. You've stopped being the predictable responder in their chaotic story. And now, they don't know what to do with you. You've become untouchable. Not because you don't feel, but because you no longer need validation from the people who drained you. And let's be real, this takes discipline. It takes deep awareness to know when you're being baited. To sit with the discomfort of silence and choose it anyway. To feel the itch to reply, to explain, to lash out, and still do nothing. That's strength. That's growth. That's self-mastery. And every time you choose silence over performance, peace over chaos, restraint over impulse, you reinforce the new standard. The new identity. The one that no longer reacts to emotional breadcrumbs. The one that doesn't chase validation. The one that no longer negotiates their self-worth based on how someone else treats them. That's Stoic relationships in practice. Relationships where your value isn't up for debate. Where your emotional system isn't available for public consumption. Where your reactions are chosen, not triggered. And over time, this silence becomes a wall. Not to keep people out, but to keep your peace in. A wall that separates you from the version of yourself who would have dropped everything to respond. Who would have poured energy into people who only ever took. That version of you served its purpose. But he's not needed anymore. You've stepped into something more powerful, something rarer, something unshakable. And in this space, you don't need to prove your strength. You just live it. Quietly. Confidently. Calmly. That's the power of not reacting. Of starving them of the one thing they crave most, evidence that they still control how you feel. And when you stop offering that evidence, they're left with nothing but questions. Questions that echo in the silence. That spiral in their mind. That haunt them far more than any message ever could. Because now, they don't just miss you. They miss who they were when they had access to you. But they can't go back. Not unless they rise to meet the new you. And most won't. Most will sit in confusion, waiting for the old pattern to return. But you won't. Because you've already decided that your energy is sacred. Your peace is priority. Your reaction is a privilege, not a reflex. This is your evolution. This is your turning point. And if they can't respect it, they don't get to witness it. 4. Silence creates curiosity, and curiosity breeds obsession. When you go silent, you become a question. Not a statement. Not a memory. A question, unanswered, unsolved, open-ended. And the human mind is wired to chase answers. Especially when the person who used to be so emotionally predictable, so constantly present, suddenly disappears without a sound. At first, they pretend they don't notice. They keep posting, smiling, moving on like nothing changed. But the silence isn't invisible. It's loud. It's uncomfortable. It lingers in every gap where your name used to show up, in every thread where your voice once added softness, in every moment they used to take your availability for granted. You see, the moment you stop showing up, the moment your presence no longer fills their emotional space, their brain starts trying to fill in the blanks. And that's where obsession begins, not from your attention, but from your absence. Your silence becomes the background noise they can't turn off. It follows them. Into their DMs, their memories, their ego. They scroll, not just for content, but for signs. Has he moved on? Is she seeing someone? Was this about me? That's what silence does. It forces them to reflect in a way noise never could. When you were explaining, defending, justifying, it was easy for them to tune you out. To downplay your words. To dismiss your feelings. But now, with nothing to read, nothing to interpret, nothing to argue with, they have to sit with themselves. And most people are terrified of that silence. They don't know how to be alone with their own accountability. That's why they chase noise, chaos, distraction. But you're not providing that anymore. You've stopped being their emotional mirror. You've stopped handing them the reassurance that they still matter to you. And in doing so, you've created a mystery. A void. An unclosed tab in their mind. And they check it. Every day. They check your page. Your name. Your status. Your presence. And when they see nothing, that nothing starts to feel like everything. The absence starts to speak louder than your old affirmations. They remember every moment you showed up. Every message you sent when they were distant. Every act of love they dismissed. And now, there's no new data to distract them from those memories. Just the stillness that haunts. This isn't manipulation. This is clarity. This is what Stoicism looks like in real time, when you stop reacting and start living from a place of self-respect. When you stop handing your emotional energy to people who didn't handle it with care. Silence is not passive. It's not empty. It's charged. It's intentional. It carries weight. And that weight begins to press on the people who once held emotional control over you. It presses on their pride. On their assumptions. On the part of them that thought you'd always be around. That thought you needed them to feel valuable. But now, they're not so sure. Now they're confused. Now they're watching. And every second you stay silent, their anxiety grows. Not because they love you, but because they can't read you anymore. You've become unpredictable. And unpredictability is magnetic. When someone doesn't know what you're thinking, where you stand, what you're doing, it creates tension. and tension pulls focus. The less you say, the more they wonder. The less you react, the more they obsess. Because now you're not performing. You're not playing into their expectations. You're not keeping the emotional loop alive. You've ended it. And in doing so, you've changed the narrative. You're not the one who begged. You're the one who vanished. The one who evolved. The one who chose peace over chaos. And that change? It sticks in their memory. It repeats in their head. Because silence from someone who once gave them everything? That's not silence. That's a storm. It's the realization that the emotional supply is gone. That the person they thought they could take for granted has become someone they can't forget. And no, they won't admit it. Most never do. They'll stay quiet. They'll pretend. But the curiosity won't stop. Because it's not about you anymore. It's about the version of themselves they saw through your love. The version that felt important when you cared. And now that you don't, they don't know who they are in your absence. That's the real addiction. The mystery of you. The access they once had. The presence that was once guaranteed. That's what they miss. And here's the most important part. You didn't do this to make them suffer. You did this to make yourself whole. Your silence isn't a weapon. It's a boundary. It says, I'm done teaching you how to treat me. I'm done giving you free front row seats to my soul. And if that boundary hurts them, that's not your burden. That's the cost of their own choices. This is how Stoic relationships thrive. Not in the chaos of constant communication, but in the calm of mutual respect. You're not silent because you're playing hard to get. You're silent because you're done being easy to disrespect. And now, the curiosity they feel? That's their consequence. That's the price of ignoring someone who once made them feel seen. That's the discomfort of realizing that mystery is more powerful than attention. If this hit home, if you're feeling that shift inside yourself where silence feels stronger than reaction, then like this video and drop a comment that says, Number 1, to let me know you're locked in with me. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because we're not done yet. We're just heating up. 5. You were their supplier, now they're in withdrawal. What happens when the one who was always available suddenly isn't? When the person they used to turn to for validation, for comfort, for attention, no longer picks up the emotional call. Withdrawal. And not the kind you see on the surface. It's deeper than that. It's quiet, but it's intense. Because you were never just a person to them. You were a source. A supplier of energy, of emotional stimulation, of constant significance. Every time you reached out, every time you replied quickly, every time you gave them even a fraction of your attention, you were feeding their emotional needs. You became their comfort drug. Not because they loved you, but because they loved the way you made them feel about themselves. And you did it without boundaries. You handed out pieces of yourself like they were free samples, hoping that somehow, they'd see the value in what they were consuming. But they didn't. They didn't see it because it cost them nothing. They didn't respect it because you gave it without standards. They weren't addicted to your presence. They were addicted to the feeling of being wanted, of being desired, of being chased. And now that you've gone silent, now that you've shut down the supply, they're crashing. They're spiraling. They don't know how to function without the emotional high you used to give them. They thought you'd always be there, always accessible, always willing to fix what they kept breaking. But now you're not. You've unplugged the machine. You've walked away from the transaction. And that withdrawal is starting to hit. At first, they won't admit it. Pride never shows its wounds. They'll act like they're unbothered. Like they've moved on. But inside, they're scrambling. They're wondering where their dose went. Wondering why the person who always answered suddenly disappeared. Wondering if you've found someone else to give your attention to. But more than anything, they're wondering why they no longer feel important. That's the true withdrawal, not the loss of you, but the loss of how they felt when they had you. You trained them to expect you. Trained them to believe that no matter what they did, no matter how little they gave, you'd still show up. That your love had no filter. That your time had no guardrails. that your energy was endless. And now that you've closed the tap, they don't just miss the water. They miss the fountain, the source, the supplier. But you've evolved past that role. You've realized that your energy is not infinite, that your attention has value, that every second you gave to someone who didn't pour back into you was a second stolen from your own future. And you're done being robbed. That's what Stoicism teaches us. That not all emotional generosity is noble. Sometimes, it's weakness in disguise. Sometimes, we give because we don't know how to withhold. Sometimes, we chase connection because we're afraid of solitude. But not anymore. You've stepped into a new awareness. One where your energy is expensive. One where your attention must be earned. One where you no longer rescue people from the consequences of their own emotional negligence. And that shift? It's unsettling for them. Because now they can't use your love as a crutch. Can't use your presence to soothe their insecurity. Can't rely on your attention to remind them of their worth. They're going to try to re-engage. Maybe with a subtle message. Maybe with a memory. Maybe with an apology wrapped in nostalgia. But you'll feel the difference now. You'll recognize the pattern. And more importantly, you'll remember the cost. The cost of showing up for someone who only noticed you when you were gone. The cost of sacrificing your sleep, your peace, your focus just to keep someone emotionally satisfied who never gave back. That's over now. You've cut the cord. Not because you're angry. Not because you want revenge. But because you've finally chosen alignment. Alignment with your own standards. Alignment with your future self. Alignment with the kind of stoic relationships that don't drain but elevate. And now, the silence you've chosen, it's not just quiet. It's transformative. It's the pause you needed to realize how much you were pouring into someone who was never ready to receive it. And the moment you see that clearly, you don't unsee it. You don't go back. You don't re-engage. Because you've tasted the freedom that comes from detachment. You've felt the clarity that emerges when you no longer give your energy to emotional chaos. And even though it's hard, even though your heart still remembers the way it used to beat for them, you've learned to discipline that heart. To hold the line. To resist the pull. Because you finally understand that your value isn't in how much you can give. It's in how well you can protect what you've built. And that's why they're hurting. That's why they're haunted. Not because you disappeared, but because they never thought you would. They thought they could come and go. Take and take. Assume and expect. But the moment you flipped the script, the moment you went quiet, the moment you stopped supplying what they consumed so carelessly, that's when they realized the high was over. And that withdrawal? It's not going anywhere. Because they're not missing just any attention. They're missing yours. The kind that was real. The kind that was deep. The kind they can't replace. And they won't find it again. Not because no one else will give it, but because no one else will give it the way you did. With the same sincerity. With the same loyalty. With the same soul. And now that soul is no longer for sale. It's protected. Guarded. Preserved for the few who understand its weight. That's your power now. Not in chasing. Not in proving. But in knowing. Knowing that your attention is a gift. And you don't give gifts to those who waste them. 6. The shift that breaks the pattern. There's a pattern you've lived in for far too long, a cycle of over-explaining, over-giving, and over-feeling. A cycle where your love was always louder than their respect. Where your effort was greater than their intention. Where you kept showing up while they kept pulling back. And here's the truth most won't say out loud. They expected you to stay stuck in that cycle. They expected the same emotional availability, the same readiness to forgive, the same willingness to sacrifice your standards just to keep the connection alive. But what happens when you don't show up anymore? When you stop playing the role they assign to you, the one who chases, who fixes, who bends? That's the shift. The quiet, powerful, irreversible shift that breaks the entire dynamic. They didn't expect it. They weren't prepared. Because for so long, your consistency gave them permission to be inconsistent. Your loyalty gave them the freedom to be careless. Your emotional presence made it too easy for them to take you for granted. But now they're dealing with a version of you that doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't flinch. A version of you who responds with silence instead of paragraphs. Who sets boundaries instead of extending invitations. Who chooses peace instead of engaging in performance. This isn't a tactic. It's a transformation. You've realized that your value doesn't increase with sacrifice. That being louder about your love doesn't make them listen better. That shrinking yourself to maintain a bond isn't love, it's emotional slavery. And when you see that clearly, something inside you snaps. The old self, the one who tolerated inconsistency, who waited for texts that never came, who interpreted silence as a challenge instead of a message, he begins to dissolve. And what emerges is someone who doesn't just know his worth, but protects it. That protection is the pattern breaker. The moment you stop rewarding bad behavior with more access, you reset the terms of engagement. And in that moment, they feel the shift. They might not say it, but they feel it. Suddenly, they're unsure how to navigate you. The same tactics don't work. The same emotional bait doesn't trigger you. The same manipulation falls flat. You've unplugged the entire machine. And now, they're left pushing buttons that don't respond. That's when panic sets in. That's when the mind starts spiraling. Because if you're not reacting the way you used to, it means something has changed, and humans fear change they don't control. They fear the unfamiliar. And now, you've become exactly that. Unfamiliar. Unreadable. Unreachable. And that's exactly where your power lives. In Stoic relationships, control is not dominance, it's discipline. And discipline is not cold, it's clear. You're no longer confused about where you stand. You no longer need them to validate what you already know. You've made peace with not being chosen, with not being understood. Because you understand yourself now. And that understanding makes you immune to their confusion. So yes, they'll reach out eventually. They'll throw out a memory. A compliment. A breadcrumb. They'll test the waters. But what they're really testing is the old version of you. The one who would have responded immediately. Who would have jumped at the chance to reconnect. But that version no longer exists. And their old strategies no longer apply. Because the shift wasn't just in your actions, it was in your identity. You've stopped being available for the same emotional games. You've stopped prioritizing someone who made you question your own worth. And now, their confusion becomes their consequence. That's the shift they never expected. That's the new pattern they have to face. The one where you're no longer an option. Where your presence is no longer free. Where your silence is the clearest message you've ever sent. They'll replay it in their minds. Try to figure out what happened. Blame the silence. But the silence isn't the problem. It's the result. The result of you finally waking up to the truth, that love without respect is manipulation. That presence without appreciation is exploitation. That effort without reciprocity is emotional debt. And you've stopped paying what they never earned. This is where stoicism becomes real. Not in theory, but in action. Where your calm becomes louder than their drama. Where your peace becomes more valuable than their attention. Where your stillness speaks louder than your old pleas. And they can't handle it. Because they were addicted to the version of you who needed them. And now you don't. You've moved from validation to vision. From reaction to restraint. From explanation to evolution. And this version of you? He doesn't break cycles. He ends them. So if you're feeling that shift right now, if you know in your bones that something has changed inside you, lean into it. Trust it. Live it. Because this isn't a moment. It's a movement. And if this part resonated with you, like the video and drop a comment that says, Number 1, to let me know you're here and that you're done with the old cycle. Hit subscribe because the next part is where we take that shift and turn it into complete transformation. 7. Rebuild quietly in the shadows. Not every transformation needs an audience. In fact, the most powerful ones rarely do. Because the truth is, the real glow-up doesn't happen when everyone's watching. It doesn't require applause or validation or recognition. It happens in silence, in solitude, in the shadows, far away from the people who misunderstood you, overlooked you, or only loved the parts of you they could control. You see, when you go quiet, truly quiet, not just with your voice but with your energy, your updates, your presence, you begin the most dangerous kind of growth there is, the kind that no one sees coming. You stop performing. You stop broadcasting your healing. You stop giving the people who hurt you a front row seat to your recovery. And in that sacred withdrawal, something incredible happens. You begin to remember who you are outside of the identity you built around being needed. You remember that you are not the person who waits around for closure, who stays available for someone who made you feel invisible, who tries to prove their worth through desperate gestures. You are something else entirely. You are the one who rises in silence, who trains in darkness, who builds behind closed doors. And by the time they notice you're missing, it's already too late. Because you're not just gone, you've evolved. You've become stronger, sharper, quieter, more focused. And none of it required their permission. They don't get to see this version of you take shape. They don't get to peek behind the curtain anymore. They gave up that access when they chose comfort over connection, ego over empathy, manipulation over mutuality. So now, you cut the noise. You stop checking their updates. You stop seeking their attention. You stop hoping they'll finally say the thing they never could. You go inward. Deep inward. Into your routine. Into your discipline. Into your stoicism. You wake up earlier. You train harder. You read more. You speak less. You no longer chase dopamine hits from shallow conversations or meaningless notifications. You stop performing and start producing. Results, growth, peace. And the irony? The more invisible you become to them, the more unforgettable you become in their mind. Because your absence starts to haunt them. Your silence starts to echo louder than any post ever could. They start wondering, then checking, then overthinking. But they'll find nothing. Because you've gone completely dark. You're not trying to trigger them. You're trying to transform you. And the transformation doesn't need to be seen to be real. It just needs to be felt, by you, in your bones, in your soul, in the way you move through the world. This is what Stoic relationships are really about. Not endless dialogue, not performative healing, not emotional bargaining, but quiet, grounded evolution. It's about becoming the person who no longer needs to be chased, who no longer fears being alone, who no longer looks outward for meaning. It's about rebuilding your identity from the inside out. One quiet, unglamorous, powerful day at a time. And the best part? You stop caring whether they notice, whether they regret, whether they come back. Because this journey was never about them. It was about you, stepping out of the role they cast you in, the overly available, overly emotional, overly patient version of you, and stepping into the role you were born for, the rare, the resilient, the untouchable. And when you return, because yes, you will return, it won't be to explain yourself. It won't be to be seen. It'll be as someone who doesn't need to be seen anymore. Someone whose silence built a presence louder than words. Someone who no longer negotiates their value, because it's already known. This is how the rarest men are forged. Not in applause, but in quiet. Not in popularity, but in peace. Not in noise, but in noble solitude. And if they ever do see you again, they won't recognize you. Not because you've hidden who you are, but because you've become someone they never imagined you could be. And that unfamiliarity? That's your armor now. That's the signal that you've outgrown the cycle, the game, the pattern, the performance. And you didn't announce it. You embodied it. That's the power of rebuilding in silence. That's the legacy of discipline over drama, solitude over spectacle, truth over attention. And when it's done right, they won't just miss you. They'll mourn the access they once had and never valued. And they'll sit with the realization that what they lost wasn't just your attention. It was access to a soul they'll never find again. So now here you are, different, deliberate, disciplined. You've walked through silence, not as an escape but as an elevation. And what's waiting on the other side? Freedom. Not just from them, but from who you used to be. The man who used to chase validation, who gave out access to people who weren't worthy, who begged to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding him, he's gone. And in his place stands someone far more powerful, the man who ignores not out of spite, but out of self-respect. The man who no longer performs for applause but lives for internal alignment. The man who understands that Stoic relationships aren't about endless dialogue, but about mutual depth. Someone who no longer needs to be heard to be felt. You see, you didn't go quiet because you had nothing to say. You went quiet because you realized nothing you said would ever matter to someone who wasn't ready to listen. And in that realization, you reclaimed something irreplaceable, your peace. So the silence you chose? That wasn't weakness. That was wisdom. That was you rising above the noise. That was you choosing presence over performance. That was you declaring, not through words but through absence, that your worth doesn't beg. That your value doesn't explain. That your peace doesn't entertain chaos anymore. And let's be honest, they'll feel it. They might not admit it, but they'll feel it. In the pauses between texts. In the empty notifications. In the quiet where your voice used to echo. Your silence will haunt them, not because you meant to hurt them, but because you finally stopped hurting yourself to stay visible to someone who only saw you when it was convenient. And now they sit with the weight of that silence. And you rise. Slowly. Quietly. Powerfully. Because you no longer need to shout your transformation. You are your transformation. So keep going. Keep building. Keep evolving. Let them watch. Or let them wonder. It makes no difference now. Because your focus is forward, not backward. You've chosen the path of a builder, not a beggar. The path of a man who doesn't chase peace, because he is peace. So if this entire journey spoke to something in your soul, if you felt that awakening, that pull towards something more, then let me know. Like this video and drop a comment that says, Number 1, so I know you're walking this path with me. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because we're not done. Not even close. What's coming next? It's not just about silence. It's about legacy. About what happens when a man rebuilds so powerfully that even his absence becomes unforgettable. I'll see you in the next one. Stay silent. Stay powerful. Stay unshakable.